Hi friends, my name's Trish Roberts and you're watching Faint Signals from Vega. So I wanted to share with you something that was posted on Mintpress News. Mintpress News' editor-in-chief is Mana Muhuesh, and this article is by Whitney Webb, and it was posted January 9th, 2019. And it's titled, How a Neocon-Backed, quote, fact checker, end quote, plans to wage war on independent media. It's kind of frightening, this one, really, but it's not surprising because it seems like they're just doubling down and doubling down and doubling down and doing everything they can to wipe out anything alternative to the narrative, the government narrative, the military-industrial complex narrative, and so forth, on social media. And I mean, without just deleting everything. It's sort of like it's a prelude to just deleting everything, even though they've already deleted a bunch of social media sites that challenge the government military-industrial complex narrative. But anyway, I just want to share some of this with you because this is something to keep in mind. Soon after the social media quote-unquote purge of independent media news sites and pages last October, the top neoconservative insider, Jamie Fly, was caught stating that the mass deletion of anti-establishment and anti-war pages on Facebook and Twitter was, quote, just the beginning, end quote, of a concerted effort by the US government and powerful corporations to silence online dissent within the United States and beyond. While a few relatively uneventful months in the online news sphere have come and gone since Fly made this ominous warning, it appears that the neoconservatives and other standard news bearers of the military-industrial complex and the US oligarchy are now poised to let loose their latest digital offensive against independent media outlets that seek to expose wrongdoing in both the private and public sectors. As Mintpress News editor-in-chief Mana Muhuesh recently wrote, Mintpress News was informed that it was under review by an organization called Newsguard Technologies, which described itself to Mintpress News as simply, quote, a news rating agency, end quote, and asked Muhuesh to comment on a series of allegations, several of which were blatantly untrue. However, further examination of this organization reveals that it is funded by and deeply connected to the US government, neoconservatives, and powerful, moneyed interest, all of whom have been working overtime since the 2016 election to silence dissent to American forever wars and corporate-led oligarchy. More troubling still, Newsguard, by virtue of its deep connections to the government and to Silicon Valley, is lobbying to have its rankings of news sites installed by default on computers in US public libraries, schools, and universities, as well as on all smartphones, computers sold in the United States. In other words, as Newsguard's project advances, it will soon become almost impossible to avoid this Neocon-approved news site ranking systems on any technological device sold in the United States. Worse still, if its efforts to quash dissenting voices in the US are successful, Newsguard promises that its next move will be to take its system global. See, this is just fascism. This is what happens, when fascism is sort of really starting to gather momentum. Censorship just follows. That's just what happens. Newsguard has received considerable attention in the mainstream media of late, having been the subject of a slew of articles in the Washington Post, The Hill, the Boston Globe, Politico, Bloomberg, Wired, and many others just over the past few months. Those articles portray Newsguard as using, quote, old-school journalism, end quote, to fight, quote, fake news, end quote, though its reliance on 9 criteria allegedly intended to separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to online news. Newsguard separates sites it deems worthy and sites it considers unreliable by using a color-coded rating, green, yellow, or red, and more detailed, quote, nutrition labels, end quote, regarding a site's credibility or lack thereof. Ratings are created by Newsguard team of quote, trained analysts, end quote. The color coding system may remind some readers of a color-coded terror threat level warning system that was created after 9/11, making it worth noting that Tom Ridge, the former Secretary of Homeland Security who oversaw the implementation of that system under George W. Bush, is on Newsguard's advisory board. As Newsguard releases a new rating of a site, the rating automatically spreads to all computers that have installed its new ranking browser plugin. That plugin is currently available for free for the most commonly used internet browsers. Newsguard directly markets the browser plugin to libraries, schools, and internet users in general. This is kind of frightening, really. I mean, I know that this is already going on, but it's just sort of this is a really kind of global sort of thing. According to its website, Newsguard has rated more than 2,000 news and information sites. However, it plans to take its rating efforts much farther by eventually reviewing, quote, the 7,500 most read news and information websites in the US. About 98% of news and information people read and share online, end quote, in the United States in English. A recent Gallup study, which was supported and funded by Newsguard as well as the Knight Foundation, itself a major investor in Newsguard, stated that a green rating increased users' likelihood to share and read comment, while a red rating decreased that likelihood. Specifically, it found 63% would be less likely to share news stories from red-rated websites, and 56% would be more likely to share news from green-rated websites, though the fact that Newsguard and one of its top investors funded the poll makes it necessary to take these findings with a grain of salt. And I imagine if it's a red-rated news site, the algorithms will just pick it up and it won't be seen hardly by anybody. However, some of the rankings Newsguard itself has publicized show that it is manifestly uninterested in fighting, quote, misinformation, end quote. How else to explain the fact that the Washington Post and CNN both received high scores, even though both have written stories or made statements that later proved to be entirely false? For example, CNN falsely claimed in 2016 that it was illegal for Americans to read WikiLeaks news releases and unethically colluded with the DNC to craft presidential debate questions to favor Hillary Clinton's campaign that same year. In addition, in 2017, CNN published a fake story that a Russian bank linked to a close ally of President Donald Trump was under Senate investigation. That same year, CNN was forced to retract a report that the Trump campaign had been tipped off early about WikiLeaks documents damaging to Hillary Clinton, when it later learned that the alert was about material already publicly available. The Washington Post, whose $600 million conflict of interest with the CIA goes unnoted by Newsguard, has also published false stories since the 2016 election, including one article that falsely claimed that, quote, Russian hackers, end quote, had tapped into Vermont's electrical grid. It was later found that the grid itself was never breached and that the, quote, hack, unquote, was only an isolated laptop with a minor malware problem. Yet such acts of journalistic malpractice are apparently of little concern to Newsguard when those committing such acts are big-name corporate media outlets. Furthermore, Newsguard gives a high rating to Voice of America, the U.S. state-funded media outlet, even though its former acting associate director said that the outlet produces, quote, fluff journalism, end quote, and despite the fact that it was recently reformed to, quote, provide news that supports our U.S. national security objectives, end quote. However, RT receives a few quote-unquote red ratings for being funded by the Russian government and for, quote, raising doubts about other countries and their institutions, end quote. And it puts in brackets, i.e. including reporting critical of the institutions and governments of the US and its allies, end quote. Newsguard describes itself as an organization dedicated to restoring trust and accountability, that's in quotes, and using, quote, journalism to fight false news, misinformation and disinformation, end quote, while it repeatedly claims on its website that its employees, quote, have no political axis to grind, end quote, and, quote, care deeply about reliable journalism's pivotal role in democracy, end quote. A quick look at its co-founders, top funders and advisory board make it clear that Newsguard is aimed at curbing voices that hold the powerful in government and the private sector to account. Newsguard is the latest venture to result from the partnership between Stephen Brill and Louis Gordon Krovitz, who currently serve as the co-CEOs of the group. Brill is a longtime journalist, published in Time and The New Yorker, among others, who most recently funded the Yale Journalism Initiative, which, quote, which aims to encourage Yale students who, quote, aspire to contribute to democracy in the United States and around the world, end quote, to become journalists at top US and international media organizations. He first teamed up with Krovitz in 2009 to create Journalism Online, which sought to make the online presence of top American newspapers and other publishers profitable, and was also the CEO of the company that partnered with the TSA to offer, quote, registered, end quote, travelers the ability to move more quickly through airport security for a price, of course. And it's quite long. It's sort of got about another 8 or 9 paragraphs, so I won't read them all. But right at the end there it says, beyond that, a key way to keep Newsguard and those behind it on their toes is to hold them to account by pointing out their clear conflicts of interest and hypocrisy, and by derailing the narrative they are carefully crafting that Newsguard is, quote, non-partisan, end quote, trustworthy, end quote, and true guardians against the scourge of, quote unquote, fake news. While this report has sought to be a startling point of such work, anyone concerned about Newsguard and its connections to the war machine and corrupt corporations should feel encouraged to point out the organization's own conflicts of interest and shady connections via its Twitter and Facebook pages and the feedback section on the Newsguard website. The best way to defeat this new tool of neocons is to put them on notice and to continue to expose Newsguard as a guardian of empire, not a guardian of journalism. So anyway, that's by Whitney Webb, who's a staff writer for Mintpress News. And Mintpress News is a really, really great independent news service. Mintpress News has got so many different things that it covers, and it's amazing really that they're able to put out such quality news about so many different things, and they rely on people's donations. They have a Patreon account, and it's really important that we support them because as you can see, this is just another one on top of a whole bunch of things like the algorithms on social media. Literally the military have paid thousands of military personnel to change the narrative in favor of US empire. That's literally a thing. It's not something made up or some conspiracy. Then you have the Hasbro, which is the Israeli government's attempts to control the narrative, and they literally pay people or give them free balloon rides, literally. Students, they do different sort of free gifts for students if they favorably change the narrative. If ever apartheid Israel is criticized, that's what happens. So there's thousands of people doing that. You see it all the time. You know, anytime Palestine is mentioned, you see a few Hasbro trolls there. There's so many different things now. It's just a layer upon layer upon layer of censorship. The algorithms are probably the most terrible, and you know, I've suffered from algorithm censorship since about 2012, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. I used to have a page that was getting about 50 to 250 people a day towards the end, and by May 2012 suddenly it came to a screeching halt, and then it started going backwards. And it actually was a really great sort of community, and it had about 58,000 people, and now it's actually 52,000, and if you post anything, barely anybody sees it. And to be honest, how is it possible? And I know also that social media platforms like Facebook, they do that kind of thing so that you'll buy advertising. But if you mention anything that's sort of counter to, you know, like if it's about Palestine or an anti-war thing, you'll notice, and that's on YouTube too, they'll I don't have a monetized site, but sites like Jimmy Dore, the Jimmy Dore Show, they literally, any post that like if it's about Yemen or Palestine, the YouTube demonetizes that particular video. That can be very discouraging because I have about 456 subscribers, and I don't know, when I post a video, about a tenth, less than a tenth of people seem to see it. And you would think that if you had 456 subscribers, this is January 2019, that maybe there'd be more than a tenth would see that, would see something that you post. Less than a tenth, really. It's between 20 and 40 people. Sometimes I might get 80, but it's usually between 20 and 40. Well, you know, that's about less than a tenth or a tenth, and that's kind of a very strange thing, and it's sort of repeatedly like that. And Jimmy Dore Show, they get demonetized. I'm nothing like the Jimmy Dore Show. I'm a nobody, and I just make commentary on things that I find interesting, on politics. Particularly, it's focused mainly on anti-war and anti-imperialism, on veganism, and some other issues that are important to me, or that I feel like, you know, it's good. Like, for example, this censorship, like a Newsguard. That kind of thing. And I also try and highlight certain independent news sites that I think are important for people to check out, just in case you aren't aware of them. So I tend to push that because we need to support those independent news services like Mintpress News and the Empire Files and the Jimmy Dore Show and Moderate Rebels, and the Real News Network has some good news stories too. There's a bunch of different ones that are good to follow, and once you find them, we need to support them, and we need to hold them close to us, because without them, I wouldn't have a clue what's going on. I mean, if you relied on mainstream news for information, which up until the internet, unfortunately, I had to. And you don't learn anything. They just tell you what the government wants you to know, and because they're really all about advertising. They're really about profit. They're not about actually presenting news. In fact, that was a slip. They're actually about preventing news, really. You know, they're about preventing news. So from, you know, any real news from getting out. So all they're really interested in is profit. That's what the mainstream media is now. So anything that is sort of, you know, creates some sort of drama and is clickbait, they're interested in that. That's why CNN for decades now, or at least a decade or so, anytime there's a, you know, some sort of a mass shooting, or there's some kind of terrorist incident, you know, like whatever they consider as terrorism, any sort of police chase, they're onto it, you know, because that's what people get all excited and tune in, and that's what they're interested in, is selling advertising. So that's what mainstream news is now, and it's always been that way for quite a while now. So Anyway, I hope that you support Mintpress News, and Mana Muhuwesh is just such a lovely person. She's a Palestinian Muslim young woman, and she's just so motivated and enthusiastic, and you know, a real deal journalist, and the team that she has with her, their writing skills are something to be appreciated, and I'm really glad they exist. And I hadn't read that article really until I read some of it to you right now, and it's kind of worse than I thought, that Newsguard. It sounds dreadful. And you just know that it's going to make it so easy for Facebook to clamp an algorithm on a red flagged independent news thing. You know, it'll just make it so easy. They'll just clamp onto it, boom, and you'll be stuffed somewhere in a news feed, that you'll be suffocated or ghost banned or whatever, and nobody will know. This is the awful thing, which I've actually found quite depressing, I have to say. Like just yesterday I was feeling a bit flat and wondering whether, just sort of feeling like you know, it's becoming so ridiculous now, the censorship and surveillance and stuff, that you know, you sort of wonder. Sometimes I know this sounds really strange, but sometimes I wish they'd just get it over with, you know, because they just want, you know, it's fascism, it's creeping fascism or galloping fascism, and they just want to stop anybody who is anti-war and anti-imperialism. They just want to suffocate that and delete you from the internet world, from, you know what I mean? And it's really hard to sort of fight that kind of, it's like trying to put a finger in a Titanic that's sinking. You know, the Titanic being the propaganda about the wars, and or the lack of information about war and imperialism, and so it's kind of, it can be really depressing trying to talk about anti-war and anti-imperialism. It's even more difficult now than talking about veganism. I thought that veganism was being you know, veganism has its own issues about breaking through, but not so much now. It's being sort of embraced by businesses, etc., because they realize there's a market for it, and of course that's what capitalism is. It's happy to exploit any sort of thing for a profit, and they've realized there's a vegan market now. So veganism is actually breaking through, and now, but it's actually, if you're anti-war and anti-imperialist, you're labeled some sort of Putin's tool or a Russian useful idiot and all that kind of thing, which is just appalling to think that this is how, if you're, you know, promoting peace, if you're trying to bring peace, if you're trying to be a if you're trying to push for peace, and if you're trying to push for the end of these awful imperialist wars for resources and hegemony and full spectrum dominance, you're labeled as some sort of a useful idiot or a Russian something or other. I mean, it's just, I can't believe this is happening. Sometimes I have to pinch myself that this is how bad it's gotten. And this is because US empire is falling, and it's desperate for full spectrum dominance. And it's sort of doing, it's so desperate that it's happy to bring out one sort of algorithm after another, and these things like Newsguard. There'll be more and more of that until it'll be almost impossible. We'll have to go back to the old style email things where you send out an email to people. And the thing is that most of the public won't know about it. You know, if they can't find it on the net or on social media, because a lot of people get their news from social media, then they're probably not going to know about it. So you're going to be talking to people who already are sort of have some awareness of these issues, and to try and break through to other people who, you know, the public, is going to be almost impossible. And that's what they want, of course. So, you know, it's kind of frightening, really. And yeah, and so sometimes I sort of think to myself, God, just get it over with. Because it's really kind of a bit soul-crushing, you know? Sort of seeing this happen. And I'm just lucky that I found these independent journalists and news services before, and you know, I found them about 2013 via Breaking the Set with Abby Martin, and for a little while there, Democracy Now! Although I don't really trust Democracy Now! Very much anymore because it pushes regime change in Syria. I think it was pushing regime change in Libya, and it pushes some of the anti-Russian propaganda. It's kind of pretty bad, but it's not bad for seeing, getting a daily news roundup, but really when it comes to imperialism and interventionist stuff, it's all over the place. But I sort of woke up to independent news through Abby Martin and Breaking the Set, I think. I was kind of shocked to see Breaking the Set because it wasn't what I expect from the US news. And I was kind of shocked and realized that I quickly realized that a lot of what I thought about, you know, American politics and all of that, and wars and things, a whole bunch of stuff, that it was all, I had no idea. And that's kind of frightening when you finally realize that. I mean, I was still, because I live in Australia, we don't really even have any real independent news here. We don't have anything like any of those that I've just mentioned, Mintpress News or the Real News Network or you know, the Empire Files and things like that. We don't have anything like that. And so we're just fed this sort of, this kind of gruel of, you know, mainstream propaganda and war propaganda and US, pro-US imperialist propaganda. That's all we get here. And so when I still, in 2008, when Barack Obama won the election, I still thought there was sort of a good party and a bad party, like the Democrats were the good party and the GOP were the bad party. You know, I actually had a tear in my eye when Barack Obama won. That's how clueless I was, you know, in 2008. And that's how they like you to be, you know, because it doesn't really matter, as I've mentioned, it doesn't really matter who's in office. It doesn't matter if it's a GOP candidate like Trump or Hillary Clinton if she had won the election, or, you know, Bill Clinton or Obama. It doesn't really matter, or George Bush Sr. It doesn't really matter. One might be more crass than the other, but they all have the same military, you know, full spectrum dominance aims. They are still corporate owned, inverted totalitarianism, and they're totally on board with any war because they're all funded, you know, they're lobbied by the arms industry and all that, you know, and AIPAC, you know, the pro-Israel lobby that is trying to keep the narrative about Israel and trying to squash anything that talks about apartheid in Israel. You know, so that's what these two parties are. In some ways, as somebody has pointed out, I don't think the Democratic Party even cares if they win an election because they still get their lobbyist money, you know, so they don't really care. I don't think either particular party cares too much because they're just two wings of the same bird and they get their lobbyist money. Nancy Pelosi has $100 million plus. She didn't get that she got that from lobbyists and from, you know, fundraising and from doing, you know, pleasing her corporate overlords. These people are mega rich. Anyway, that's how it is now. It's like, and so I actually thought, you know, that the Democratic Party was some kind of good party and a party of diversity. They just exploit diversity and they exploit identity politics so that they can get in. And then they do nothing or worse. for people. They're not interested in the public. So anyway, that's where I was in 2008, and it took till accidentally coming across, I don't know how I came across Breaking the Set with Abby Martin on RT.com, but I came across that, and I was thinking, wow, this is just completely different. You know, I was sort of a bit shocked. You should check out that show. It finished 2 or 3 years ago, and Abby Martin's now doing the Empire Files and Media Roots Radio. They're both great things, great programs, and you know, she helped open my eyes, and I'm forever grateful to that. And of course, she had a lot of guests on her Breaking the Set, which I found them on social media, and I started following them, and it's been very helpful to me, like Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal and people like that. It's been very helpful to me, and now it's like once you ring, you can't unring that bell once you realize what's going on. But the awful thing is, though, once you do realize what's going on, it's really sort of kind of a, you realize how kind of effed we are, basically. You know, when you realize what's really going on through real and independent news, you sort of realize how stuffed we all are. And that includes, you know, the whole climate change, the climate crisis thing, because, like, you know, if you've been following anything, they're actually going the other way and doing worse and worse things to make it worse than it is. And just recently, we've had temperatures here not here in Tasmania. Fortunately, it's cooler here because it's an island. But say on the mainland, if you have a look at a map of Australia, it's getting worse and worse. Every year, the temperatures are worse and worse, and like some places are close to 50 degrees. Like South Australia gets terrible hot temperatures. They're close to the desert, and Western Australia also. And there was one point in time where half of Australia, and this is South Australia and part of Western Australia and some of Victoria, there was this big swathe of pink on the map, which means that the temperatures were, you know, between 45 degrees Celsius and the late 40s. I mean, that's just really awful, and can get untenable for life. And some temperatures just recently in those areas has been sort of 50 degrees, and at nighttime 33 degrees Celsius. 115 degrees, I think, Fahrenheit is 45 degrees Celsius. So, you know, this is only going to get worse, and I really worry, I really fear for some parts of Australia. I don't see how, as it continues, I feel like South Australia at some point might actually be unlivable, you know? Now, we have really short supplies of water here because of animal agriculture sucking up the water, and that's not even addressed yet. I've talked about animal agriculture and its devastation in relation to the climate crisis and the sixth mass extinction and the acidification of the oceans and eutrophication and all of that. It's a real nightmare, and people keep denying that. There's a lot of people keep denying that. Green groups ignore it. The government ignores it, because there's billions and billions of dollars to be made exploiting animals. But it's going to, at some stage, it's going to be impossible to continue that practice of animal agriculture, because cows and other animals are not going to cope with this heat. There'll be nothing to feed them, and in fact, so that's coming to an end. People are going to have to stop using animals just out of even the climate crisis. You know, that's how it's going to be eventually, which is sad that people can't just do it voluntarily and do what's right, because it's the major driver of climate crisis and all those things I mentioned. Just recently in our supermarket, they had this sort of broccoli shortage, and they said that the reason being that it was so hot in the supplier's area that it just, I don't know, it didn't turn out very well, and it wasn't fit to be put on the supermarket shelf. Now, I don't know what that means, as in fit put on the supermarket shelf. But you know, there's going to be more and more of that. In fact, if you watch the looming food crisis on the program On Contact with Chris Hedges, it talks about how, you know, we have a looming food crisis and that we're going to have to stop using animals, end the practice of animal agriculture, because by 2050 we would need 50% more of planet Earth to be able to, using animals to be able to feed the public, continuing on with that practice of, you know, using animals. So, you know, it's completely putting aside that if you're vegan like I am, it's an ethical thing to stop using animals because they're not our resources, they're sentient. But you know, it's actually an unsustainable thing, and we're going to have to stop using animals because it's completely, it's impossible to continue that. It's completely unsustainable practice, and it's destroying the planet, the environment, and it's contributing greatly to the climate crisis and so forth. So, you know, this is something we're going to have to grasp, and we're going to have to do something about. It's a real issue, and it would be great if people could embrace that issue and become vegan and not wait for a time when it's absolutely a crisis, you know, which it's getting to. And, you know, this looming food crisis is coming, where you know, agriculture is on the brink of some real problems, you know, in relation to this climate chaos. You know, the weather is so unpredictable now, and it gets really crazy hot in some places. And, you know, plants can't adapt to that sort of thing. They can't adapt to crazy heat or insane cold and so forth, or torrential rain that just comes out of nowhere and all that kind of thing. So, you know, the planet is going to have a major food crisis. So this is why we need to be vegan. But the most important reason to be vegan, of course, as I regularly say, is that animals are not our resources. Now, I hope that you don't reach for the unsubscribe button because I talk about this, because it's something that I throw in regularly, because everything is, you know, I can find a connection with veganism pretty much with a lot of the issues that I talk about, because it's about otherization of a group and about exploiting a vulnerable group and so forth. So please stick with me when I mention this, because it's important that we try and open our mind to these various issues that we may not be familiar with. And as George Bernard Shaw said, every great truths begin as blasphemies. Great truths begin as blasphemies. I think that's how the saying goes, and veganism is one of those great truths. So anyway, you know, the whole broccoli thing, and I read just recently that in South Australia there was a part of I think it was stone fruit. They were literally cooking from the inside out and completely ruined a crop. I think that was in South Australia. Anyway, so this is what's happening, you know, it's going to make it so that our food shortages start and prices continue to go up because there's food shortages. There's going to be more and more of that. So we can do something right now and go vegan. We don't have to wait for any government or corporation to give us permission. We don't have to wait for capitalism to end. We can do it right now. We don't have to wait. And this is something that I find amazing, that when I mention veganism on social media, I'll hear somebody say, oh, well, yes, that's got some merit, but you know, having children is actually worse for the planet. Well, yes, of course, you know, population is a real issue. By the way, there's Nandi, and he's got his little Bird Be Safe collar. I just wanted to let you know that we don't dress up our cats in sort of collars. It's actually a collar that alerts birds because it's colourful. Just wanted to mention that. But the of course, you know, overpopulation is a real issue. Like, where we actually should have remained at 500 million. That was plenty for this planet. And now we have 7 billion, and it's going to be 10 billion by 2050 if we actually make it to 2050. You know, really. So I mean, that's insane. The insane levels of people on the planet. It's just totally ridiculous. you know, so when somebody says, you know, well, as if we have to stop having children and therefore, you know, veganism isn't an issue. That's so ridiculous. You can chew gum and walk at the same time. You can decide not to have children, but you can be vegan. You can be pushing for alternate energy, you know, like solar and so forth, and be vegan. You can be doing a whole bunch of stuff and be vegan. You can do that right now. And so when people sort of go, oh, yes, that's got merit, but overpopulation, having children is the problem. You know, I just think, God, people will do anything to avoid just taking personal responsibility and, you know, doing something that is addressing violence in our life, and it's majorly addressing climate crisis. You know, I'm astounded, and I think this is why we're going to go extinct, because people don't want to do anything in their own personal life. They don't. It's that saying by Tolstoy, everybody wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change themselves. I mean, I just look at this and I think, okay, you know, I mean, one day when there's no food available because, you know, it's too hot for food to grow and you're starving, you can say, but I had my animal products. I really enjoyed my cheeseburger. I really enjoyed my milkshakes. I really enjoyed my yogurt. You know, I mean, this is you know, I really loved my dairy products. I loved eating fish. You know, people, when they can think back and wax poetically about the time when they were able to munch on decomposing flesh and secretions of sentient animals, you know, while they're, and because they'll be starving. This is really how it is. I mean, I just, you know, we really are, I'm sorry, but we really are a stupid species. You know, it's no wonder we're going extinct. We're really just hairless primates who had a technological bent, and but we're really just very, very selfish, and we have a violent, inherent violence in us. And this is why we're going extinct, because we cannot get out of our own way. We really are just animals, like every other animal, with a little technological bent and some other skills, but really we're incredibly self-oriented, and we are also very, you know, we're into otherizing, and this is bringing the end to us. We're an evolutionary experiment gone wrong, really. So, you know, we are coming to an end, and I have to say that I don't see much that's redeemable about our species at this point, with all the violence and everything, and the patriarchy and the whole sort of thing. I mean, it kind of is really, really sad. I mean, if you've even recently watched the Gillette commercial, capitalism knows how to exploit any social movement. But there's this commercial by Gillette, and it addresses toxic masculinity, and it's really good. But you should see the comments section. How people just completely sort of freak out at the idea that they're freaking out about the fact of a shaving company addressing toxic masculinity and asking men to take responsibility against toxic masculinity, and there's all this outcry about it, like as if that's a bad thing. Yes, capitalism can exploit any social movement, but I don't mind too much if it has some education aspects to it like this. But this is how a lot of people react. It's like they don't want to abandon these awful behaviors that are oppressing other people on the planet. You know, because this is, you know, the toxic masculinity is a construction that's been indoctrinated into children, into male children. It's not normal to be oppressing and being violent to other people. That's not normal. If it was, there wouldn't be 22 veterans killing themselves every day when they come back from Iraq and Afghanistan and places like that. Violence doesn't sit well with most people unless you're a psychopath or a sociopath. It doesn't. You know, so why wouldn't we want to get rid of toxic, this indoctrinated toxic stereotype, and have male children more empathetic and more kind to one another and want peace and not want war? Why wouldn't we want that? And to see these idiots, I'm sorry, they're idiots in the comments section pushing against and railing against this message, it's just so fucking sad. It's so fucking sad. I just think, God, what are we? What have we become? You know? For all the good things about social media, it really shows the ugly side of us too. It really does. Anyway, that's all I want to say. I know I got off the track at the end here, but this is all sort of, it's something that it's a real thing for me, these different issues. I see them all as really important. They're all connected to, you know, the toxic masculinity and the patriarchy and the war and the imperialism and veganism. It's all connected, and that's why I end up sort of going off a little bit on that. And the way we deal with this climate crisis that's probably going to make us extinct and a whole bunch of other species on the planet. It's all connected, you know? Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. So my name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time. Bye for now.